MCU Synergy. Two words that strike fear into any comic book reader. Go to hell is basic. I hope your favorite character gets a popular adaptation that fundamentally changes their comic forever is smart. It's possible. It's terrifying. For people who are not familiar with comic books, the barrier to start reading a series may seem impossible to overcome. DC has famously rebooted their whole universe a couple of times, while Marvel prefers a more individual book-by-book approach. But the intention for either one is very simple: bring in new readers, who don't need to be caught up in years and years of character and universe development. Readers who can come out of the theater from one of their movies and just pick up on issue number 1 of the character that they just watched. With Daredevil, it was no different, but he was far from the first character Marvel did this to. And to understand what happened to him, we first need to look at the biggest example, and the most infamous case of that kind of movie synergy. And that is, of course, Spider-Man's reboot in the comic One More Day, by J. Michael Straczynski and Joe Quesada. Well, mostly Joe Quesada. In the 2000s, Spider-Man was at the height of his popularity, in no small part thanks to Sam Raimi's movie trilogy starring Tobey Maguire. The movies focused on an overworked, down-on-his-luck Peter Parker, while he tried to navigate between his personal and superhero life, all the while trying to make something happen between himself and the girl of his dreams, Mary Jane Watson. Due to Spider-Man responsibilities, Peter couldn't hold down a job, so he was always struggling with money, he could barely keep up with his college classes and coursework, which made him fall behind, and he was always busy running off to save the city or whatever, which caused problems in his relationship with MJ, both before and after they started dating. They're great movies, I love them so much, but they were very different from Spider-Man's comic landscape at the time. At that point in the comics, Peter had already gone through all the struggles shown in the Raimi trilogy. He had found somewhat of a healthy balance between being Peter Parker and being Spider-Man, he had a steady job as a teacher in Midtown High, and of course, he and MJ were happily married. His identity wasn't even a secret anymore since the events of Civil War. Very different from what movie audiences would have seen at the time. So, in 2007, same year Spider-Man 3 came out, Marvel rolled out the One More Day storyline. In it, following a series of attacks on his family due to his public unmasking, Aunt May gets fatally injured. In order to save her, Peter makes a deal with Mephisto, who asks for Peter and MJ's marriage in exchange. MJ throws in a little extra about his identity being a secret again, and beepity boppity boo, we're back to the old status quo. And we see it in action in the follow-up run, Brand New Day, by Dan Slott and Steve McNiven. His identity is a secret again, he's back to being single, having constant financial struggles, and even went back to being a freelance photographer for the Daily Bugle. Now, the comics were back to being very similar to what movie audiences were used to. I should say though, the Raimi trilogy was not the main reason behind this decision. Spider-Man's status quo was very much a topic of debate, centered mostly on whether Peter being a husband made him less relatable to readers. Nerds don't get married, guys, everyone knows this. And there was even a discussion about making him and MJ get a divorce, but Marvel vetoed it, worried that it wouldn't play well in the red states. Good thing they went with the safer option, of writing in Spider-Man making a deal with the devil. Anyway, the One More Day story on its own sparked a lot of debate and controversy, and it's widely considered to be one of Marvel editorial's worst ever decisions. The then main writer for the Spider-Man books, Straczynski, even wanted his name removed from the last 2 issues. It caused a stagnation of Peter Parker's character development that persists to this day, almost 20 years since the story was originally published. Either way, as I was saying, the Raimi trilogy might not have been the direct cause for this reboot, but I think it's unrealistic to assume that the movie's success and their box office revenue didn't play a role in Marvel greenlighting the decision. It was an easy way to lower the barrier of entry into Spider-Man comic books. Whether this was a good way to do this, of course, is up for debate. I mean, sure, you might be bringing in new readers, but you also risk alienating all of your existing ones. And it's especially risky when you can't deliver new quality stories to those readers after such a big change. One that many of them consider to be a regression for the character. Spider-Man is the most famous example, but this is far from the last time Marvel has done something like this. And when Daredevil got his own TV show released in 2015 to a lot of critical and fan acclaim, he wasn't treated any differently. The show found itself in a similar position to the Raimi Spider-Man trilogy in terms of its relation to the ongoing comic run at the time of release. It was completely different because it was depicting a period that, in the comics, Matt had gone through ages ago. It followed Matt as he started out as Daredevil while he tried to get his law firm off the ground and keep his nightly vigilante activities a secret from his friends and the rest of the world. Meanwhile, in the comics, then written by Mark Waid and Chris Semany, Matt's identity as Daredevil was well known to the public. He was in a much happier place than he'd been in the runs that the show was adapting. He had a girlfriend and a best friend who weren't against the idea of him being Daredevil, and he was enjoying a bit of a celebrity status due to being a superhero, all while living in San Francisco, not New York. And that's not to talk about the tone of that run, which is far more lighthearted and optimistic overall, which was a sharp contrast from the show's dark, gritty tone. But those comics had earned that. For over 15 years, from Smith through Bendis, Brubaker, Diggle, and finally Mark Waid, Daredevil had been on one long journey. Wade's more optimistic tone wasn't just a silly quirk. It started as basically Matt's defense mechanism so he wouldn't spiral like he did before. As the story developed, Matt slowly but surely worked on healing his past trauma. He started opening up to people and seemed on a path of happiness, or something close enough to it. The run served as essentially an ending for that overarching story, and could easily serve as an ending for the character as a whole if Marvel wasn't, Marvel. Not long after the show premiered, Waid and Semany wrapped up their story and left the book. They were then replaced by Charles Soule and Ron Garney. From the very first issue, the difference was very clear. We were back to the dark, gritty Daredevil people recognized from the Netflix show, without a doubt. Also, Daredevil was back in New York, his identity was a secret again, and he even had a new black suit. It wasn't exactly like the one he wore in the show, of course, but the familiar color scheme was definitely not a coincidence. The way this reboot happened wasn't revealed until a little bit later into the run, but it was handled well enough, and the whole thing was pretty good and well written, which made it so this was much better received than Spider-Man's Brand New Day. At the start of the run, he and Kirsten are broken up, and Foggy isn't exactly happy with him and his Daredevil activities. Again, despite some differences, it was clear he was trying to ride on the hype of the show. It just so happened to be doing it while also giving us great stories in the process, some of which even made it into the new Daredevil show from 2025, like Dark Art, which introduces the villain Muse, and Mayor Fisk, which, well, Fisk becomes the mayor, as the name says. But I fear that reboot might have caused some pretty serious, long-lasting effects on Daredevil comics for many years to come. And not necessarily in a good way, much like One More Day did for Spider-Man. That shift was subtle in Soule's run, but then it became very clear in the run that followed by Chip Zdarsky. Now, I've been very vocal on here before about how much I dislike this run, and I know some of you love it, and I'm not trying to judge you for that. I'm not the holder of all the Daredevil knowledge in the world. I'd never claimed to be. That sounds like a lot of responsibility. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present you with a series of objectively correct order of events, and then give my opinion on what came of it. If you disagree with the opinion part, you're more than free to tell me. I would actually love to hear a different perspective on this. So, Charles Soule and Ron Garney take over the Daredevil book in December 2015, where they reboot the character's status quo from where it stood at the end of Mark Waid and Chris Semany's run. It feels familiar to the Daredevil show, which lines up well because for the next 3 years, the comics are coming out alongside new seasons of the show. The two had a very similar tone, feature similar characters, so, it worked. There were even a couple of issues where said characters looked exactly like their show counterparts. But then, things changed. In November 2018, Charles Soule's run came to an end in the death of Daredevil. In that same month, Daredevil, the TV show, was cancelled by Netflix after its 3rd season. Those two things were unrelated, by the way, not planned to happen so close together. Soule's exit had been announced previously, so no surprises there, but Marvel expected the show to continue into season 4, and so did everyone involved. Charlie Cox even turned down acting jobs thinking the season 4 renewal was secured. Either way, the cancellation lined up pretty well with the release of a new comic run by a new writer, Chip Zdarsky, and a new artist, Marco Checchetto, both with a pretty good rep. And with the show cancelled, people wanted their Daredevil fix, so obviously they decided to check out the new run. The barrier of entry had never been lower. And it helped that the run not only continued Soule's commitment to resemble the tone of the beloved Netflix take on the character, but it even took that several steps further. A lot of people got into Daredevil comics from this run, as it felt extremely familiar to what they already knew, and really enjoyed from what they had seen in the show. And hey, I might not like the run, but I can recognize that if you're someone fresh out of the show, you'll have a great time reading it. But that goes away the more comics you read. Because Zdarsky's Daredevil run might have a lot of cool hype moments and aura, but it's missing something that's kinda crucial in the realm of good storytelling, and that is character development. Zdarsky's Daredevil isn't trying to build up the character the way previous runs did. It's more interested in being familiar to new readers than being consistent with how these characters had naturally evolved in previous runs. Similar to Brand New Day for Spider-Man, it locks them into a state that more closely resembles the one people know from an adaptation. A very good adaptation, again, but still an adaptation. And I want to stress this because it's important. Daredevil is one of my favorite TV shows ever. This isn't a criticism of the show itself, the same way I wasn't criticizing Sam Raimi's Spider-Man earlier. It's a criticism of what happened when Marvel began treating that adaptation as the default for these characters. Adaptations should take inspiration from the comics, not the other way around. Anyway, I've yapped enough, you get it. So what actually happened with Daredevil? You see, Zdarsky has been criticized for roughly the same things in his time in both Marvel and DC. I'm not getting into them here because this video isn't really about him, but one of them is how much and how hard he tends to deconstruct whatever hero he's writing for, completely breaking them down both physically and mentally, and essentially forcing them to rebuild throughout the rest of the run. Not a bad thing on its own. One of the most famous and one of the best Daredevil stories follows that exact same premise. But the difference between Born Again and No Fear by Zdarsky is that Born Again actually feels believable. In Frank Miller's story, Matt is broken down by something completely out of his control. Kingpin worked out his real name and used it to take everything away from him. His job, his home, even Daredevil. Everything that made Matt himself. It's no wonder he became more violent and more paranoid while all of this was going down. There's an escalation there that actually works and makes sense. In No Fear, on the other hand, Matt's essentially broken down by his own incompetence. After an accident with a truck, yes, another one, Matt's reflexes are sluggish, which results in him killing a low-level thug by accident, something that goes against decades of character development. In the comics, Daredevil is far more experienced with near-mythical martial arts skills. Believe it or not, he does have some level of enhanced durability and reflexes, in part due to the vague nature of the radiation that gave him his powers, and in other parts due to years of training. He has fought countless times before in far worse shape than whatever was still left over from his recovery here. Forcing this situation feels cheap, and honestly directly taken from the show, where Matt is far less experienced, often outsmarted by street-level thugs, and where he spends a decent amount of time injured. Again, this is not a dig on the show. There, it makes sense. Not only Matt is at the start of his career, he does have a more realistic tone which works for this sort of thing. The comics are a different thing though, and Zdarsky had to go around that in order to justify this deconstruction trope. Which, sure, serves a purpose. It might not be a huge deal in the grand scheme of things because it serves the story, right? Except, there are a lot of ways you can do that without dumbing down the character. Frank Miller broke him down without making him incompetent. So did N. Nocenti, Kevin Smith, Brian Michael Bendis, Ed Brubaker. Breaking this guy down is like a staple in these comics. So, Forced Synergy was already the reason why the main plot of the run kicks off. Surely, it can't get worse, right? Well, that's where the characterization comes in. I could talk about Fisk, or Foggy, or Frank, and how his dynamic with Matt was set back years, but I want to focus on two characters who I think had the worst of it. One of them is Matt, like I've already been doing, but the other, well, we'll swing back to them. As I said, Matt's skills were essentially nerfed in order to make him more in line with his Netflix counterpart, but the problem isn't exclusive to just his skills. In the show, Matt is a deeply troubled character, struggling with his place in the world, navigating all sorts of contradictions about who he is. The thing is, he still has a charm, wit, and qualities that make him, you know, a likable character. The show has a dark tone, but it still manages to keep Matt's redeemable qualities, similar to Bendis and Brubaker's runs, where he's going through the ringer over and over again, and he's having a hard time coping with it, but his virtues still come out and really make you root for him. The original 3 seasons didn't adapt either of those runs directly, but those vibes were very much there. Zdarsky isolates one aspect of Matt from the show, the suffering, and turns it into a defining characteristic of Matt in the comics, showing how much he misunderstood what made Matt Murdock such an interesting character to begin with. He took all the troubles, all the struggles, the contradictions, the guilt, and threw it all into his story with nothing to balance it out. It's an exercise in trauma, suffering, and Catholic guilt. Something else I've talked extensively about, by the way, in this video right here. There's no character development, there's no lesson to be learned, there's no progression of events that will culminate in anything meaningful, there's just nothing. Except suffering and guilt, because that's what Netflix Matt does, right? He just suffers. There's nothing else to it. It's not like the show ends with him being happy with his friends or anything. Matt Murdock just supposed to be miserable all the time, obviously. Sorry, got carried away there. What I'm trying to say is, Zdarsky's run may feel familiar to those who know Matt Murdock from the show, but it's a bit of an insult to the comic version of the character. In fact, when you get down to it, you realize it's also a poor imitation of what the show was doing. It's just a character deconstruction without any of the reconstruction. It's boring and honestly a bit of a drag to read. Zdarsky's effects on the book are still felt to this day. It was obviously felt in Ahmed's run, who inherited a book from him that did not feel like Daredevil anymore. The current run by Stephanie Phillips seems to slowly be putting things back on track. There's still some synergy and Zdarskiness to it, but it's far less egregious than it used to be. We'll see where it goes in the future. But there's one thing that hasn't gone away, and unfortunately, I don't think it will anytime soon, if ever. There's a character that was probably the biggest victim of Zdarsky's MCU Synergy obsession. One that's been changed so harshly that she barely feels like the same character anymore. And that is, of course, Elektra Nachios, the woman without fear. You know what? She deserves her own video. And that's exactly what we're doing next week. So don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss it. I'm leaving you here for today, but hey, if you're someone who wants to get into comic books, by the way, don't be tricked by that barrier of entry that I mentioned earlier. It looks steep, but it's really not. Marvel and DC both relaunch their titles all the time. Just pick an issue number 1 from a character that you like and go from there. Even if it's Zdarsky's run. Seriously, it's not a big deal. Anyway, if you'd like to support the channel, liking, commenting, sharing, and of course, subscribing are all great ways to do that. And I appreciate it a lot. While you wait for the next video, you should check out this one right here. Spider-Man is in it. Thank you very much for watching, as always, and I'll see you next time. Bye!
Kasada!